Hello, it's time for another session of our Luke Bible class. We're glad that you're tuned into this video, whether it is on the day that this has been posted or at a later time. We're just glad that you're here and continuing with us. This is our 11th class, class number 11. And the only reason I number those is so folks who are watching these, perhaps at a later time, they can kind of keep them in order. If you want to be turning in Luke, we're going to be in chapter 16 for this session, and we're going to cover that whole chapter, verses 1 through 31. This is the second time that I have posted some study questions for you on the Facebook group page. And then I also, the class's Facebook group page, and then I've also posted those on the church's Facebook page as well. So you can look at those. Maybe you've done that already. If you haven't, you may want to just pause this video and go look at those. The whole purpose of them is just to kind of get your mind into the text a little bit prior to this discussion, or you just may want to go through those as we go through our class tonight, but encourage you to do that one way or the other. So, Luke chapter 16. This is a chapter in Luke's gospel that begins with a parable and ends with what some would classify as a parable. We're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. But it appears to me that Luke's use of this material that's recorded here in this chapter is that last teaching of Jesus, which is of the rich man and Lazarus, actually serves as an illustration of the teaching that Jesus is doing throughout this chapter. And we'll talk about that more when we come to that in our study this evening. So let's work our way through this text today. We begin with this parable of the dishonest manager. And I want to go ahead and read the first question on the sheet. What troubles us about the parable of the dishonest manager? That's the first 9 verses here in chapter 16. And this parable does trouble us. This is the parable that Jesus tells about a rich man who had a servant who was his steward or his manager over all of his property, all of his finances. And it came to the man's attention that this steward was wasting his possessions. And so he confronts the man about it and tells him, okay, you're done here. You're going to turn in the account of your manager because you're fired, basically, as we would say it today. And so this manager doesn't put up a defense. He doesn't say, well, he's being wrongly accused or anything like that. He just asks himself, okay, so what am I going to do since I'm no longer going to have access to my master's money and finances, which apparently he had been spending on himself and wasting in other ways. So he says that I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. So he's looking to the future, his immediate future. How can I work this situation so that I can be taken care of when I no longer am able to be manager? And so he comes up with a plan. And his plan is to contact his master's debtors and to tell them, okay, take your bill, whatever you owe, and let's slash it. For instance, to the first one, he asks him, how much do you owe? And he says, 100 measures of oil. And he said, okay, take your bill, sit down, and quickly write 50. That is, make it look like you only owe my master 50 measures of oil instead of 100 measures of oil. And the man he's happy to do that, of course. Then the second one, he asks, what do you owe? 100 measures of wheat. Okay, write your bill for 80. And so 20% discount off of his bill. So you've got a dishonest manager who is asking the people who owe his master debt to act dishonestly and change their bill, and they're more than happy to do it. So this parable is filled with people who are frauds and fakes. They're dishonest. They're taking advantage. They're not good people. Well, he does this, and then the master, it says in verse 8, commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. He was impressed with what this man did, because in verse 4, the manager says, I've decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. He's counting on, this manager, dishonest manager, is counting on these debtors to his master to remember what he did for them and how much money he saved them, so that they would be willing to be benevolent toward him in his need. And he knew that time of need was coming. So the master, he doesn't get mad when he learns what his steward has done, what his manager has done. He commends him for his shrewdness in this. Now, here's the punchline. Jesus says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Now, before we get to Jesus' teaching based on this parable, let's go back to that question. What troubles us about this parable of the dishonest manager? Well, it troubles us that Jesus is using dishonest activity as a means of teaching us a lesson. It troubles us that, well, I think one of the things that troubles us is we try to do with this parable what we do with other parables, and it challenges us. For instance, in the parable of the prodigal son, we associate the various characters in that parable with others. The father we associate in that parable with God. The older brother we associate with the Jewish rulers of that day. The son, we associate ourselves with that typically. And so we make those assignments and make application in that way from the parable. That's not always appropriate in understanding what Jesus is teaching. And this is one of those occasions. And my point is that it would trouble us that, okay, who does the owner of all this represent? Who does the manager represent? And who do the debtors represent? Well, I think when we try to go down that path, we're going to find ourselves to be very, very frustrated with this parable. Why would Jesus use dishonest behavior to teach a lesson? A couple of reasons. One is, you got to admit that's a very memorable thing. You're not going to forget that Jesus did this, and it forces us to think about it more closely. If the meaning and the intent and the purpose of the parable were readily evident to us, it wouldn't take much effort on our part in recalling it to say, okay, this is the point. But when it forces us to think about it, that becomes ingrained in our minds a little more. And that could possibly be one of the reasons why Jesus did this. But I think he did it for another reason, and I think that's what the point of all of this is that he is comparing the people of this generation with the sons of light. And look at how diligent and shrewd people of this generation are, of this world, in trying to take care of things so that in the future they will be taken care of. That's his point. That was the shrewdness of this dishonest manager. And Jesus says, look at that. The sons of this world, that's what I should be saying instead of this generation. That's the terminology Jesus used here. The sons of this world are more shrewd than the sons of light. In that, the sons of light do not give near the attention and diligence and work and effort in preparing for their future, which is a much more important future than the sons of light in trying to prepare for their future in this earthly life. I think that's the point that Jesus is making here. Now, he's going to go on from this, and he's going to make some points, and that's what we find, I believe, in verses 10 through 13. So let's go ahead. Well, before we do that, back up to verse 9. I have another question on the sheet. I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Again, a problem is with this parable is that, okay, who are these friends? Make friends by means of unrighteous wealth. And so you read different commentaries and so forth, and they're trying to assign different identities to who are the friends? Well, the friends are, as he says later, are going to receive you into eternal dwellings. Again, I think all that Jesus is doing here is he's taking a very understandable and knowable circumstance from this man and his dishonest manager and what he does to help to try to take care of himself for the future. And he tries to drive a lesson home to us as sons of light, that we would be as diligent and as on point and put in as much effort in working towards true riches and eternal dwellings. And so who are the friends? Well, I think instead of trying to identify specifically who those might be, I think we're better off in thinking in terms of the fact that we should use, as Jesus describes it, unrighteous wealth. And he's not saying that to tell us that money is inherently evil. That's not the point here. The contrast is between unrighteous wealth and true riches. And the true riches are eternal. True riches are pure. Unrighteous wealth is temporary, and it is often used, not always, but often used for unrighteous purposes. And so that's why that contrast is there. But we have to deal with it. And Jesus, I think, is one of his points here, and I think that's going to become more evident as we go through this, is that how we use present earthly wealth has impact and effect on an eternal future. Okay, so let's move on with this and notice what Jesus continues to say, starting in verse 10. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. Have you ever heard the saying, how you do the little things is how you do everything? Sometimes we try to dismiss what are considered small things, and then we can be negligent in them. We can be slack. We can be inattentive. But that's really not true, because how we handle small things is going to be how we handle big things. That principle is true, and I think Jesus is applying this principle here. When you compare earthly wealth and finances, it's a small thing as compared to eternal wealth as well, eternal riches. But how you handle that, how you handle the temporal and the physical, has something to say then about how you handle the more important eternal things. He continues, if then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? I think that's a continuation of this point. If you have not been faithful in what is another's, who will give you that which is your own? This comes back to question number 3 here, which is something we need to be constantly reminded of. To whom does our wealth belong? Well, our wealth is not ours. All things are the Lord's, and we're called upon to simply be stewards of what God makes available to us. And so that can be extremely helpful to us, I think, as we think about finances and wealth and all of those kinds of things. It's not ours in the first place, it's God's, and we've been entrusted with it, and we're responsible for our use of it, and we need to ensure that our use of these things is in alignment with God and His will and His kingdom. So back to our text, no servant can serve two masters. He will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Now, this is really going to become even more focused in the purpose for which Jesus said these things when we get into this next verse, verse 14. But at this point, this unique role that wealth and finances play in people's lives, it is such a big, influential, powerful thing. And it can become very detrimental to us, or it can become something that becomes a very effective and useful tool in service to the Lord. But you can't serve God and money. That doesn't mean that, okay, God is righteous and money is unrighteous. God is good and money is evil. That's not the point here. There have been many righteous people who have been blessed with great wealth. I think about people like Abraham, Job, David. You can think of in the biblical accounts of people that are extremely wealthy, but are also people of righteousness. And I say that to try to step away from a line of thinking that is possessed by an awful lot of people, and that is that all wealth is evil. And that's just not true. It absolutely is not true. But let's continue on here with our text, starting in verse 14. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, interesting characterization of Pharisees here. They're lovers of money. They heard all these things and they ridiculed him. One point we might want to make here is that this began, you'll remember in verse 1, by Luke saying, he said to the disciples, and so this was teaching that was directed primarily at his disciples. But based on verse 14, there were also Pharisees present who were hearing the things that Jesus was saying. And they were, he said, lovers of money. And they began to ridicule him for the things that he was teaching here. One of the things that these individuals embraced and held to was the notion that material wealth was a sign of God's favor. If you were wealthy, that meant God was raining these things upon you, and that was a proof that you were in God's favor. There is an incident in the ministry of Jesus, the rich young ruler. And it's interesting that in the aftermath of that, where Jesus gives his teaching about how difficult it is for the wealthy to enter into heaven, the kingdom of God. Easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle. What I want you to remember about that is the disciples' response to that. Their question was, well, then who can be saved? Now, the only reason you would ask that question in that way is if you believed that wealth was a sign of God's favor. And Jesus is saying, no, that's actually difficult for a wealthy person to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, that had implications for their understanding of salvation. And so back to here, these people were lovers of money. Again, they associated with the accumulation of wealth to God's favor. And so they ridiculed what Jesus was saying here. But he says to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts, for what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. Again, Pharisees, we learn a lot about them here from this little text. They were lovers of money, and Jesus said they are also ones who sought to justify yourselves before men. The question that I've asked here, there's number 4, for whom did Pharisees have greatest concern? They had greatest concern for men and how men viewed them and being exalted in the eyes of men. And Jesus said that's wrong. Because what is exalted among men, what impresses men, what would exalt you in the eyes of men are the very kinds of things that God sees as an abomination, the accumulation of wealth to yourself for your own purposes, very selfishly, that is an abomination to God. And yet you see that, you have interpreted that, you have understood that to be something that justifies you in the eyes of men. Men are impressed with that, but it's an absolute abomination to God. And then verses 16 and 17, for the law and the prophets were until John. Since then the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone is forcing his way into it. But it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. As we look at that, I want us to be reminded of the fact that in looking at and studying the text, there's more than one question to be asked. The question we kind of by default go to is the question what? What is being said, what happens, and what is meant by that? Good question, needs to be asked, but if it's the only question we ask, then we can easily get ourselves into trouble. And I think this is an example of that. Another question that has to be asked is why? Why does Luke insert this at this point? Why does Luke record this in connection with everything else that's being said here? And that's going to become, I think, even more evident when we get into the next verse, but we'll get there in just a second. I believe that Luke's point here is that this attitude and approach toward wealth and money and God's favor and blessing and all of those kinds of things is a good example of how far astray these Pharisees. Again, let's remember, we have a negative thought when we come across Pharisees because as we read the New Testament, they're always opposed to Jesus. But the people who were living this, they had very positive thoughts about these people. These Pharisees were looked upon as admirable and ones worth emulating and following. But Jesus is saying about these men, they're actually far away from God's purpose and even God's law. And so the law and the prophets were until John, but since then the good news of the kingdom is preached. Okay, that's been the message of John. It's been the message of Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is upon you. But everyone is forcing his way into it. Now, admittedly, this is difficult. Okay, the statement of Jesus is difficult. I'll just tell you what I think. I'm the teacher. I get to tell you what I think. I think what he is saying here is people are forcing their way into it in the sense that they're trying to come up with their own ideas about what it means to be in that kingdom and being a part of that kingdom, about having God's favor, being embraced and accepted by God, when those ideas and those notions are absolutely wrong. Even though they're being held by people who are looked upon and relied upon for their instruction in faith and how they ought to live in relationship with God. That's these Pharisees, lawyers, scribes, rulers of the synagogue, all of these folks that are always button heads with Jesus. And Jesus is just, again, he is showing that sharp contrast between what God really wants and intends and what they have been taught for generations about how you go about doing this. And Jesus says no. That's just absolutely not wrong. It's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. And yet here were people who were living in disregard of the law. What God had wanted his law and the prophets to do in as far as shaping the thinking and the attitudes and the outlook of all of these people who would propose to be followers of his, it hadn't happened. And it's as though they were setting aside, it's as though they were setting aside God's will. And Jesus is simply saying here, it cannot be done. It's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for God's intent and will to be just set aside, to be made void. And what a foolish people you are in doing that. Now, we get to verse 18. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Now, what Jesus says here is not difficult to understand. It just is not. It's troubling for many people. It's very troubling, but it's not difficult to understand. But again, I want us to think about not what Jesus says here, not because that's unimportant, because it is important, but why does Luke put that here? It just seems like he randomly inserts something into this flow of thought that just seems so out of place. But there's a reason for this. So why he does this, and I think he does it as a means of demonstrating. Here's an obvious example of how you've tried to set aside what God actually intends. We've been talking about wealth and finances and your understanding of those things and attitude towards them. Well, here's another example of how you're disregarding what God actually wants and intends to be true, and it has to do with divorcing and marrying again. I think Luke is using that as an example of what he has just said in verses 16 and 17. So, I think that's why we find that here. Okay? Now, he's going to go on now, though, beginning in verse 19, with this last teaching, and it's the account of the rich man and Lazarus. And I'm running out of time fairly quickly here, so forgive me. I don't have a bell that's going to end my class, so I'm going to keep going here. You may, if the hour is getting late or you don't have the time right now, you may want to pause it here. This would be a good place to do that and come back to it. But I'm just going to keep going here. I want to go back to make sure I've covered these questions. I did number 5 about everyone forcing his way into the kingdom. Okay, yeah, the last ones have to do with this last portion, the rich man and Lazarus. And we know this. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple, fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. Here is a man who has all the money he needs and much, much more. And there is this poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, just a very pitiable man. All he wanted was to be able to eat the food that falls from the rich man's table. That's it. The scraps, the leftover, the stuff you're going to throw away anyway, he would have been very happy to have had that. And even the dogs came and licked his sores. I mean, this man is in such bad shape. And the poor man dies. And he's carried to Abraham's bosom. And the rich man also dies, and he's buried. And in Hades, he's in torment, and he lifts up his eyes, and he sees Abraham afar off, and there is Lazarus with him. And he calls out, Father Abraham. In this account, this rich man is a Jew. He acknowledges Abraham as his father, and a little bit later, Abraham is going to speak back to him and refer to him as child. So he is a descendant of Abraham. He calls out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water to cool my tongue, for I'm in anguish in this flame. And Abraham says, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you are not able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house. I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, for if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Okay, so we're quite familiar with this teaching of Jesus. Here's how I want you to think about this, though. I want you to think about how this account of the rich man and Lazarus serves as illustration of everything that Jesus has been teaching. We have the exceedingly wealthy and we have the exceedingly poor in the rich man and Lazarus. And Jesus is trying to drive home to his disciples. Remember, this teaching originally was to the disciples, verse 1 of chapter 16, that how you handle wealth and finances has eternal ramifications. It impacts your eternity. And yet the characters in this account from Jesus are a rich man, a rich Jew. And the Pharisees, remember, are lovers of money. And they're ones who think that the accumulation of wealth and the possession of wealth is a sign of God's favor on you. This rich man is one that the Pharisees would have identified with readily and said, yeah, that's the guy. That's what we want to be like. They would aspire to be like this rich man because he was a rich man. And poor Lazarus is the kind of person that they disregarded and neglected and wanted nothing to do with. They just kind of pushed them off to the side. They didn't want to see them. They didn't want to hear from them. They didn't want to interact with them. They wanted nothing to do with them. And yet Jesus then takes it from this earthly existence into the eternal existence beyond the grave. Now look at what the situation is. Who would you aspire to be now? Would you aspire to be in the rich man's place? Or would you aspire to be in Lazarus' place? And it's a powerful message. Okay, so let's come back to this life. How are you handling the wealth that you have been blessed with and given and provided with by the Lord? Are you still going to say that the accumulation of wealth is evidence of God's blessing on you and God's favor on you? That wasn't true for the rich man, was it? You can accumulate these things and it not be any indication of God's favor. And at the same time, you can be in abject poverty and it not be a sign that God has disregarded you or forgotten you or in some way is not looking upon you favorably. That's just not the case. I mean, this teaching of Jesus really does turn on its head even a lot of our own thinking about what we have and how readily we equate that with God's blessing. And if God's blessing us, then God must be okay with us. And so it's easy for us to begin to think in terms of the good things that we have as evidence that everything's good with God. Go back to this verse. When he says that to the rich man, in your lifetime you received good things. And in Lazarus' lifetime, he received bad things. So here was a man who lived under very deplorable circumstances. And God did not work to change those deplorable circumstances. We have to come to grips with the bad things that happen in our lives. And we have to quit assigning a meaning to the bad things that happen to God's displeasure or disfavor with us. People can go through life and bad things happen all the way through, and yet that does not mean that they are people with whom God is displeased. Now, yes, we can live a life in such a way that brings misery and torment and difficulty and struggle in our lives by a choice of following sinful behavior. That's true, but that's not the point of this parable. We just have to think about the fact of what Jesus is trying to drive home to these people. And that is your whole understanding of wealth and poverty and its spiritual implications. You're just wrong-headed in your thinking about those things. And teaching these people that how you handle those things needs to be in alignment with God and His purposes. God has blessed you, and you have been allowed to have these great things from God. The rich man, you're a wealthy man. What would God's intent and purpose for you to be in that circumstance? To use that to take care of people who are poor and to help them in their poverty and their suffering and their difficulty. That's consistent. And because what you do in this life has tremendous implications for the next life. And so Jesus says the sons of the world are much more shrewd than the sons of light. The sons of light need to have the same shrewdness in using their wealth and their finances in view of eternity to come and to work toward that end. Okay. I want us. There are some other lessons, I think, to be drawn from the rich man and Lazarus, and I just can't bear leaving that without talking about it a little bit. I've got 7 things listed here. Excuse me. Number 1, the primary intent of this parable, or this parable, I'll get to that in a minute. This teaching is that present use of wealth impacts eternity. Let's not forget that. Number 2, the temporal versus the eternal. That's how Jesus wants us to live in view of eternity. We can get all the advantage and everything good in this life, but if we miss out on the eternal, then we've got nothing, absolutely nothing. Number 3, having a bad life, that is, that bad things are happening in your life, is no indication of God's disfavor. And neither is having a good life, that is, good things happening, an indication of God's favor. Now, we can live our lives in accordance with the will of God, and we are blessed because of that. But just that one-to-one correlation of I've got the good things, that means I've got God's blessing. That does not necessarily follow. So we've got to be a little more careful in our thinking about those things. Number 4, God's intended power and purpose for His Word. This is one of the fascinating things about this from Jesus. The rich man, when he realizes Lazarus can do nothing in eternity to help his circumstance, says, okay, so let's send Lazarus back to warn my brothers so they don't end up here as well. And Abraham says, they have Moses and the prophets. The rich man is convinced that it would be more convincing to his brothers if someone were to come back from the dead to warn them. And Abraham says, if they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to listen if someone were to come back from the dead. You know, we have God's Word right now. And we might wish that there would be some miraculous, marvelous event that's going to happen that's going to convince somebody that they need to give their life over to the Lord. But God's intent is for the good news, the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ, to be the power that works in people's lives to convince them of these things, not some miraculous event that takes place. What a tremendous message here about the power of the message of God. Here is something else. I was introduced to this thought not all that long ago, but I can't remember where it came from. We have 2 primary characters in this teaching of Jesus. One of them is named, and the other one is not named. How come Jesus gave the poor man a name, Lazarus, but the rich man was not ever given a name? There's something very powerful in that, I believe. And that is, even when we're in very dire and difficult circumstances, we have a name before God. He knows our name. And in the sense of that He acknowledges us, He recognizes us, and we have a relationship with Him. And then in eternity, we still have that identity with God. Remember the teaching of Jesus when in a judgment scene, when He says to those on the left, the goats, He says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." I don't know your name. And that's not saying that God is not omnipotent and that He doesn't know everything, but in the sense of knowing your name, there's no relationship here. And so we have this poor man. God knows his name, Lazarus. I want God to know my name. It's kind of a subtle thing here, but I think a powerful message from this parable as well. Number 6, we get some hints into what it is like beyond the grave, what that existence is. And I call it hints for a reason. There are certain things that we do know that God teaches us about what is beyond in eternity. And we embrace those things, and they're precious promises of God, and they are so important to us. But there are some details that we get hints at. Okay, so is this telling us about what it's like after the judgment, or is this telling us what it's like before the judgment? Is this Hades, Sheol and Hades, the realm of the dead prior to the eternal destinies, or is it not? Those are interesting points of discussion, and there are things that are hinted at or suggested to us. I just want us to exercise caution and graciousness in the discussion of those kinds of things, because I don't believe Jesus was giving this teaching intending for it to primarily be, okay, I want you to know what it's like after this life. And even though that might not have been his purpose, he does tell us some things here about existence beyond the grave. And so it's very intriguing for that reason. The last thing I have down here is that the place of Abraham in this account, why is it described that the rich man, he lifted up his eyes and he saw Lazarus in Abraham's bosom? Well, I think the whole point of it being in Abraham's bosom and the conversation between the rich man and Abraham goes back to this understanding that the Jews had. They felt like they were God's people. They were secure in their relationship with God because they were descendants of Abraham. Well, here is a descendant of Abraham, the rich man, who is not with Abraham in eternity. But we have Lazarus, the poor man, the disadvantaged man, who is in Abraham's bosom. He is right there with him. And I think that's the point of it being described precisely in that way. Now, one other thing. I put it as a bonus question. And this is not important, but it is a point that I have thought about many times. Is the teaching about the rich man and Lazarus a parable? We call it a parable. But as I think about a parable and what a parable is, it is taking something that is very commonly understood and used then as a means of teaching a profound lesson. A sower went out to sow seed, and it fell on different kinds of soil. Well, people knew that. They had seen people sowing seed. They knew they could relate to that exactly. A young boy who decides he wants to go off and spend his inheritance in riotous living. Well, people could relate to that. There was nothing about that account or that story that was unusual or puzzling in any kind of a way. But in the rich man and Lazarus, we're taken beyond the grave and things that we're told happen there. That is totally beyond anybody's experience or knowledge or understanding. I believe an argument could be made for this not really falling into the classification of a parable, or if it is a totally unique parable. It is totally different than any other parable for that very reason. But then the problem is, okay, so if you don't call it a parable, what do you call it? I don't know. That's the thing here, because it is we would have to classify it as a hypothetical account, which the parables were. They were hypothetical. They weren't real historic events that he's talking about necessarily, although they may refer to historic realities and events from people's lives. So just something to think about. And if you want to call this a parable, I'm not going to. That's not going to bother me in the least. I'm going to tell you you're wrong for doing it. But my personal approach is that I typically don't refer to it as a parable. although I do. I did it earlier in this class, didn't I? It just kind of rolls off the tongue. So anyhow, we'll continue our study. The next class will be posted on Sunday. It'll be class number 12. We'll be looking at chapter 17, verses 1 through 37. Hope you can be a part of that with us as well. I apologize. We've gone 45 minutes in this class. That's longer than I want to go, but there's no bell to shut me down, so I can do whatever I want. Hope to see you at our next study. Thanks.